Today is Thursday, April 8th, 2021, and this is the Westwood School Committee meeting. At this point, I'd like to call the meeting to order, and we'll start with the roll call attendance. Tony Mullen.
Here.
Maya Plotkin.
Here.
Amanda Phillips.
Here.
Charlie Donahue. Does anyone see Charlie?
I don't see him.
Okay, well, I'm sure he'll join us as we'll just get started. At this point, I want to recognize that this is a live broadcast and that online stream is available through the Westwood Media Center and also online at www.westwood.k12.ma.us/live. This is to provide real-time public access to the activities of this school committee in accordance with the March 12th, 2020 executive order of Governor Baker. Okay, so at this time, we will start with the superintendent's report. Emily, we'll start with the transition to full in-person learning.
Okay, good. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Nice to see you. So yes, this was something of a milestone in this crazy year this week, where we transitioned from a hybrid and remote model to a full in-person and remote model. So I was able to get out to some of the schools this week, and I can tell you it was really fun to see what was happening. It was nice to see and hear students, and I would say in particular, when I walked over into the high school, I was really struck by how much talking and laughing there was. I realized that it's been pretty quiet over there this year, and just to sort of walk down the hall and hear people discussing things in class was it was great. So I want to thank Ken Aries in particular and our entire operations department. They have dealt with the logistics and the implementation of returning furniture to classrooms and redoing bus assignments and getting food service up and running and setting up tents. They really have been fantastic. And I also want to thank principals, who I feel like as a group, maybe I have not thanked enough this year. They have been managing quite a lot, just sort of iteration after iteration of details and logistics and contingency planning, and have somehow gotten it done, mostly in good humor. So thank you to them as well. And of course, teachers and students, you know, they're sort of embracing new routines now. There's new things to learn now that we have everybody back. You know, we had to get the middle school kids understanding how lunch was going to work, for example. And but I think we're off and running. And I do want to thank, I'm going to share my screen here for a second. Oops, wait a second. I thought I was going to do that, but I don't have the right thing up. Here we go. There were some folks who made an effort to welcome people back in style. So I think that the high school PTO had something to do with this greeting. And I think maybe a parent put this up and showed her kids jumping for joy here as they returned to school. So that was a nice surprise on Monday morning. And I thought you might want to get a glimpse of what 8th grade lunch looks like now at the middle school. So far, the weather has been great. It's been very pleasant. I am somewhat obsessively checking the weather report. I think we will unfortunately have to use those tents next week. But for now, things are going pretty well. So we're off and running. I do just want to clarify a couple things. I've gotten questions from maybe a handful of parents about school schedules and the length of the school day. So I want to clarify a couple things on that front. I mean, as you are well aware, our schedules this year in hybrid and remote have exceeded the state's requirements for time on learning. We call it instructional time. Specifically looking at how we use synchronous instruction. And as you know, when we made the transition this week to full in-person, we wanted to make sure that the current schedules for the rest of the year meet the state's time on learning regulation. They have, for a typical year, they have invoked that as of Monday for elementary. as of the 26th for middle school, and they haven't done that yet for high school, but we just felt that it made a lot of sense to make sure we were ready for that in case it happens. So, we're back on track in terms of our time and learning, our instructional minutes that we have in our schedules currently. I think some people have wondered why we didn't just go back to last year's school hours. And, the short answer to that was it just isn't feasible to just put it all back. We had to create schedules this year that were designed to work across multiple models. And to do that, we had to make a lot of decisions about how staff was allocated, how staff time was scheduled, and that of course impacts how student time is scheduled. So, I just want to give one example. Because we have several fully remote sections in K-3, and as you know, we prioritized getting K and 1 back in 4 days a week from the very beginning. And we did that by creating many kindergarten and grade 1 classes. So, because of those parameters, we have many more elementary sections this year than we would in a typical year, which means we had correspondingly many elementary classes that needed to have art, music, PE, and library, but we didn't have any more specialist teachers to do that. And so the impact of that is that our elementary students typically have 45 minutes a day of specials. This year they have 25 minutes a day of specials because our specialist teachers just have to get to more classes. So they sort of spend less time with each class. So that's what has happened. At the elementary level, our schedule right now is 40 minutes shorter than it would be in a typical year. So 20 minutes of that has come out of the specials. And then the rest of it is because we don't schedule 30 minutes for lunch and 30 minutes for recess this year. We've scheduled one block of 30 minutes, kids eat lunch, and then they go run around. So, it's just a way of sort of explaining that though the day is shorter, we have not impacted core instructional learning time, which is not to say that we fully intend to put the specials back next year to 45 minutes a day. We value those. It was just sort of a trade-off this year. So we've got kind of a similar situation at the middle school and high school. As you know, in both of those places, we organized schedules this year around fewer, longer blocks. And one impact of that is we just don't spend as much time moving kids around from place to place. So, at the high school in a typical year, you have 9 4-minute passing times a day. It's like 36 minutes of just like moving around. And so this year, the day at the high school is 45 minutes shorter, but we don't have a 30-minute lunch. We've cut down passing time by 20 minutes. We don't have a 5-minute homeroom. And so, really the amount of instructional time is not shorter at the high school. Similar at the middle school, it's passing time, a reduction in passing time, and also difference in time spent in the arts rotations, but not core instructional time.
But Emily, just a quick question. With those long blocks in the high school, they're taking breaks, right? It's not.
They are taking some breaks. Yeah, and I think it's still coming out, pretty well in terms of the amount of time. Yeah.
No, I was just thinking that 85 minutes, I know it's a long time to sit, but I did see a class out there that seemed very happy actually. And they were taking a quick walk around, I think, the building as part of their break, which I thought was
that we've definitely done that. We've encouraged teachers to do that, to let kids get up, go outside, take off a mask, and, have a few minutes in those blocks. Absolutely. Yeah. So, as I said, we'll of course restore the specials at all levels next year. And it's interesting, as the school committee knows, the middle school and high school have been engaged in scheduling work, thinking ahead to next year. Just to clarify for the public, this work predates the pandemic. This is something that came out of the entry plan results. And we had contracted with a scheduling consultant last spring. And then there was the closure and we had to scrap that. But we have been able to pick the work up this year and bring the consultant in, and there have been committees at the middle school and high school working on it. And it's some exciting work that's coming out of it. And I think in some ways kind of we're looking for silver linings, it's been somewhat serendipitous as we think about our priorities for next year, with intervention and mental health supports being our priorities. You know, the middle school and high school have really been able to think about those goals in addition to something that came out of the entry plan, which is increasing core instructional time. So there will be more information about this soon. Mr. Redmond and Ms. Davenport are going to be reaching out to parents, I think right after the break, about a parent information night on this topic. I think our consultant's going to come and kind of talk about some of the thinking behind it. So parents should be on the lookout for that next year. We are also turning our attention now to summer programming. So we anticipate a very robust extended school year ESY program for students who are eligible through the special education process. There will be both in-person and remote options for ESY. And teams are meeting right now. They're operating from sort of I would say like a very generous lens in terms of thinking about what kids may need this summer. In addition to that, we are going to run some intervention programming that targets some critical literacy and math skills at elementary, middle school, and also transition to high school. And the participants in that program would be students who we identify through our assessment data this spring, who we think demonstrate some disproportionate gaps in some of these critical skills, who we think would benefit from that kind of programming over the summer. So that assessment work will be happening also after, sometime after the April break, and students of those parents, we will be reaching out to them. And as you know, though we aren't running our summer enrichment program, we have collaborated with the rec department to provide them with dedicated space, I think in 3 buildings, so that they can run their programs, which are, very important. And we're really glad that we're able to partner with them. So that's sort of where we are on that front. I'll pause and see if there are any questions.
Yeah, can I have 2 questions? So one question I'm hearing from a lot of people, and I know about the schedule for next year in light of the middle school and high school, is the basic schedule of start and stop times going to be the same across the 3 levels? Is one question I'm hearing a lot of parents. Yeah. And then the second question, well, I know that's my first question.
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point, the answer to that is yes. I think we haven't really laid the groundwork for a big change there. I was talking to Lemma the other day, one change is that this year, all 5 elementary schools have had the same beginning and end times. And so we thought it might be worth looking at whether or not that's possible with bus routes next year. Usually Field has an earlier time. Yeah. So we thought we'd look at that. But I will just say, sort of thinking forward, Tony, that the middle school and high school people, in thinking about changes in their schedules and like where lunch falls and all that, they have been thinking about making sure that it's possible to move those forward later in the day, because I assume that is, something we want to take up.
Great. So, thank you. The second one is, this is probably more for the May meeting. It'd be helpful to, I don't know what the high school, but I know Mr. Redmond shared there would be some staffing changes because the way the schedule changes, positive staffing changes. So it'd be helpful to just maybe talk about that at the May meeting, understanding kind of the more intervention support and some of the additional changes. So
yeah, that's great. We'll talk about that in May. Okay, good. Anything else, or I can move on to COVID data? Yeah, okay.
Go on to COVID data.
All right. So I will just quickly run through where we are here. So this is Westwood's COVID data. It was updated just a couple of hours ago. And, last month when we were talking about coming back in person, we noted that there really had been a big decline in March, in February, and then in March. And, I will say, unfortunately, it does seem to be ticking up a little bit here, sort of in the later part of March and still early in April. Still nowhere near where we were back in January and February, but we are seeing a little increase in student cases. And so correspondingly, you can see there's a little uptick in the incidence rate as well. The percent positivity rate in Westwood continues to be below 2%. So that's good news, and in fact, decreased a little bit in the last week. So in terms of just thinking about the big picture in Westwood, in the district, so far this year, we've had 245 positive cases, students and staff. Again, that COVID team is busy. They have tracked 2,115 students and staff and provided consultation to 623 people. Our cases, if we just look at them by grade, you can see here that, we continue to see generally more cases in the older students than we do at the elementary level. We had a little activity sort of in the older elementary grades, I would say, in the last couple of weeks. Just taking a look at positive student cases by month. We've talked about this before. Clearly, we saw sort of a huge uptick here, came down in February. March ended up being a little bit less than February, and April, still early. It's only April 8th. And so we'll keep an eye on where things are for the rest of the month. It's just another way to look at that with case counts. I do think that the notable thing right now is to talk about quarantines, though. We are seeing some differences here. So this is a monthly snapshot, basically benchmarked at each school committee meeting. And last month, we were saying that we thought we were in a really good place in terms of the number of kids in quarantine. And unfortunately, right now, as of this morning, we are at 64 students in quarantine. Some of that is because we had to quarantine an entire preschool classroom. So that's certainly contributing to it. And then I think that there were a couple of youth soccer teams in town where there were some close contacts, as I recall. So, I was asking the COVID team, do we think that this increase in number, we've only been back full in person for 4 days, and I was just trying to get a sense of, as students are now seated at 3 feet, is that impacting the number of kids who are getting quarantined? And, it has in a couple of cases, but they say so far, this number really is about that preschool class and close contacts in the community. But we'll watch that as well. Wanted to say a little bit about the student pool testing program. So as you know, what we really hope is that we can get 70% participation in the program, and we're not there yet, but there is some good news to report as compared to last month. So we did another push and encouraged people to register, and we have seen an increase in the number of students. And so when you do all the numbers, we are at a little over 50% district-wide. I think there is and I put the breakdown by elementary schools again, maybe create a little sense of competition here, but I think that another thing to look at is this is the percent registered. At the elementary and middle school, the percent registered and the percent actually tested is quite similar. At the high school, the number of students who sort of have actually been swabbed is quite a bit lower than the percent who've been registered. And so we're thinking about that from a logistics perspective, and also maybe even a way to incentivize it. At preschool, elementary, and middle school, the test kind of comes to you, whereas at the high school, you actually have to go to the testing location. And so we're thinking about how we can work with kids on that. I want to put in another plug for pool testing. We do think that this is really an important measure for us. And, given that we are clearly not out of the woods as a community in terms of COVID, I want to remind people to really continue with, faithful adherence to our mitigation measures, to consider getting involved in the pool testing. Two things I want to highlight is I just want to underscore the importance of staying home if you're symptomatic. I think we've had a couple of situations where people, thought that they were just experiencing spring allergies, and came to school. And I just want to encourage people to not make that assumption, and make sure that you stay home and get tested, because some people have made that assumption erroneously. I also, with the April break coming up, I had emailed out to the community a week or so ago the state's updated guidance around travel. And I just want to strongly advise adherence to the state's recommendations around travel. So it's less, it's an advisory now, it's not a requirement. And so our COVID team will not be requiring that people present evidence of a negative COVID test. But just, you know, in the spirit of being community minded, we really ask people to adhere to that recommendation. And then finally, some good news. The state announced last week that they will continue to fund the student pool testing through the end of the school year. So that is great news for us. And related to that, we had said that we would implement the staff pool testing through Miramis through the April break, and then kind of assess where we were with that. And so, you know, I would just say that I think it's working well. And it would be my recommendation that we just continue with Miramis for the staff testing for the remainder of the school year. But I just wanted to, you know, run that past the committee tonight to see if we need to have further discussion about that. I feel like the fact that now we aren't going to have to pay for the student testing, you know, makes it reasonable to keep going with the staff testing.
Right.
Emily, what's the percentage of the staff that's being tested?
So, you know, that has gone down. We were at about, I'd say 65% at some point. And I don't know what the percentage is off the top of my head, but it's gone down considerably because people are fully vaccinated.
Okay.
So we are seeing a drop off. I think at this point we have, I mean, it's probably about 35%. We're seeing 200 and some people a week who are still accessing the testing.
I think it's also helpful to remind folks, especially those that might be worried about getting tested and the resulting consequences of quarantining, that if your child is tested in the pool testing and it has a positive test, they would then get a rapid test immediately. And if that's negative, there is no quarantining. So the only people I think who would end up being pulled for quarantine are those who would have a positive rapid test. Is that right?
That is right. And the rapid test has worked pretty well. We've been able to implement that for the couple of positive pools we had. I will say we had one situation where we had a positive pool over the long weekend.
Yep.
And so we didn't have the capacity to do the rapid test then. And we did ask people to go to one of the state testing sites and get their own individual PCR test. And people were really great about doing that.
But that's not, that probably won't happen again. That was the Friday holiday, right?
I think that was fluke.
Yeah, but I just think it's important to note that even if your child tests positive in the pool, that doesn't necessarily mean they automatically quarantine.
No.
In fact, they would only quarantine if they then subsequently tested positive with the rapid test. So maybe that'll give people some comfort who were worried about the quarantining aspect of it and hesitating to sign up.
So how do we, so, you know, we don't have very many people here at this meeting. How do we get that? How do we get that word out?
I mean, maybe it's worth it. You know, those I know that the emails that go out from the principals whenever there's a positive test, I think the principals have started adding a link to the registration, which is great. That's really helpful. We don't have to dig for it. Maybe it's worth just to remind people in that email, you know, oh, and by the way, if your child does test positive in the pool, they will then have a subsequent test and only will quarantine if that subsequent test is positive. That, I mean, that goes to everybody, you know, when we have a positive case.
Yeah, that's a good point. We need to get the word out.
And I should know the answer to this, but if someone is a close contact and goes out and gets a negative test, the CDC guidance, I think it's 5 days now. If you go out and get a negative test, do we follow that? Have we adopted our policy to that or not?
I have to say, Tony, I do not have the numbers of the time changed so many times with the
Yeah,
number of
yeah, okay.
phases. I'm not sure, so I wouldn't want to say, but certainly the amount of time that people are quarantined has significantly shortened
Okay.
what it was in the
Yeah.
beginning, and you get tested. Yeah.
Okay, that's fine, thanks.
Yeah.
One more question. For the teachers, have all of the teachers who've wanted a vaccination appointment been able to get them, or they're still struggling to get appointments?
So I can't say with 100% certainty, but I will say the last time that we checked, it seemed very, very low, the number of people who hadn't been able to access vaccines, and that was a couple of weeks ago. So
Okay.
I think it's been like very successful in terms of access.
And do we know how many teachers, what percentage of teachers have been vaccinated, or is that something we can
I don't know.
discuss? Okay.
I mean, I could ask people if they are willing to share that.
Okay, thanks.
Okay. So I'm going to turn it over to Lemma now, talk about the Q3 financial report.
Thank you. So I want to start just by saying that it's good to be back. And at this point in the fiscal year, being in Q3, I'd say I'm overall reassured by the numbers that I'm looking at. And I'll walk you through the detail in the report that I've shared. I'm projecting that we should be able to close this fiscal year without a significant or potentially any reliance on the additional special education reserve funds that we've set aside this year for use in case of need, or any other unbudgeted offsets that we would have otherwise been forced to use if we were in a difficult position, but I don't foresee that at all. I'd say with the exception of specifically contracted services and supplies, the other big areas of salaries and other expenses, which has items like tuitions in it, those areas are at or below the spending rate that they were at last year at this time. So they are reassuring at this point. Our overall spending is 66.5% this year versus 67.2% last year at this time. And I know last year we then went into remote and shut down, so that helped us close the fiscal year. But overall, I'd say that's a reassuring position, given all of the model changes and all the expenses that we've had with COVID. So I want to highlight a few noteworthy elements of the report. I can share my screen for one of the charts. So you're looking at salary expended at Q3, and I just want to remind you that in the spring last year, as we prepared for FY21 impacts from the pandemic, we implemented some budget cuts. And so some of those cuts are seen specifically in the K-12 instruction cost center here in the middle school and in the high school cost centers. We reduced some positions, mostly they were vacant positions, in order to reallocate those funds for potential COVID expenses. We also added elementary teaching staff. And so although there was some turnover savings across the board, and that's kind of scattered everywhere, it's hard to tell you exactly which buckets it falls in, but elementary at net still is roughly where it was last year. Where we did add elementary teaching staff, we added them relatively, they were hires that were relatively lower on the teaching scale. So the impact wasn't very significant in our current spending. All of this data, I have to warn you, is a little bit muddied by some accounting factors. So for example, how teachers elect to receive their paychecks and whether they want their pay spread over the summer or not. So there are variables that muddy the story here, but overall, I would tell you in diving into it, every time I dove in, I saw that what I found in the raw data was reassuring and confirmed the narrative that we've been discussing. Outside of teachers, I just want to remind you there were a few other support positions, so aides that were added to address needs specifically in grades 2 to 4 for remote learning. And in student services, we did add COVID nurse team staffing. But you'll see the confidence is there because the numbers just keep us roughly in line. The district-wide cost center group, that one looks a little bit like we're spending faster than we did last year, but that's again an accounting issue that's explained by a collective bargaining reserve that was in the budget last year, and that was not being drawn down. So it's an accounting issue that made the FY20 gray bar there look lower than it would have been had that reserve not been there. So that's all there. I'd say at this time, looking at salaries and trying to project out, I do anticipate salary savings at the end of the year. And I'd say we've carved out at least 387,000 in net salary expense that we can use to offset expenses in non-salary areas. But I want to flag that we have a deficit in the cafeteria in the food service department, and we will need to absorb some of those costs. So some of that savings that we get from salary, we will use to absorb any deficits in food service. I also want to take a moment to just acknowledge the great work that was done over the past few weeks, both by principals and by Vinnie Cordone, our food service director, to increase lunch participation. So a lot more families have been buying, students have been buying lunch, and that helps us to break even. So we're not quite at that point yet, but we're approaching that. We're doing much better than we were. And I can present numbers on that later on, but I would say the last time I looked, the lunch participation had increased by at least 40% over where it had been. And this was before we came back to the in-person model. This week's numbers look very strong.
I'm sorry, we want to clarify that people aren't buying lunch, they're ordering lunch because
Yes,
it's in fact free. But,
it is free. Yeah.
but paradoxically, by ordering a free lunch, we then access federal reimbursement, and it helps us in terms of our food service deficit.
Thank you for reminding us of that. Yes, exactly. So it's a win-win for the families that participate and for us as a district. So we hope more families will take advantage, and we've been responding and listening to feedback on the menu items. And so I think that students have been happy to see what's been offered.
Sorry, Lemma, I know that recently the district has started sending out reminders on Sunday to order the lunch or whenever it was. And I think those are super helpful. We may want to just add in there a reminder that it's free. I don't know if it already says that, but if it doesn't, you might just want to make the point that just remember this is free, and that might also spur some more people.
We'll definitely say that again. Thank you for that. So that's been good news. And the other department that I want to just highlight that has experienced a lot of change here and with the Custodial Department. So in the district-wide number, we see that it appears as if our expenses are higher than last year, but one of the departments within there is Custodial. And that one has been, I find, at least 100K in savings in custodial salaries, and that's primarily from overtime and primarily explained by the reduction in building use. So I just want to highlight that as well, because that's a significant change. And our custodial department has responded to many, many changes in helping us come back to the in-person model, as well as adapting throughout the year. So I give them a shout out and appreciation for all of that flexibility. But that's buried in these numbers somewhere as well. I will jump to non-salary now. So in non-salary, you know that this year we incurred significant non-salary COVID expenses. In technology, the technology department falls under K-12 instruction here. So that's really explaining the increase in spending and the fact that that group cluster of cost centers is significantly overspent where it was last year. In technology, we spent over 623K in devices and software applications. And then elsewhere, you will see in student services and district-wide is where PPE spending has been. That doesn't seem very apparent here, and that's because it's offset by other savings. So because of the delayed seasons in athletics, we have 120K less in spending in athletics so far to date. That doesn't mean we'll continue to see those savings at the end of the year, because I know that participation in sports has picked up, but that was one impact that we felt. There are also some building maintenance expenses and utility bills that were just delayed this year. So I expect us to incur those. In utility, you might be wondering what happened to our utility expenses. So I was surprised not to see a very big increase. I expected more of a cost due to COVID for electricity or fuel, especially because we were, asking and advising people to improve ventilation by opening their window and getting some fresh air in there. So we did see an increase in fuel costs of 37,000, but only 37,000. So I think that's explained by the reduction in building use that occurred simultaneously. So we had fewer needs for heating the buildings over the weekends, for example, and in the evenings, and that may have contributed to some of the savings that we saw, as well as maybe just weather, but that's there. And then I'm noting we had 21,000 in net electric savings comparing year to year. So I looked at both the usage and the bills, like the costs that we've paid in comparing year to year here. What else should I highlight? And then I also would say another noteworthy element of the district-wide spending is that bus expense is a little bit lower. We were able to negotiate some savings for remote Wednesdays, for example, and a slightly reduced rate for the beginning of the school year, professional development days. I don't think that first of all, we're back now and Wednesdays are no longer remote. But the other thing that we will start to see in transportation expense is that we won't be depending on the offset in the bus fees as much as we have in prior years. We weren't able to collect as much. I have collected some bus fees from recent registrations, but our net bus fee collections are still well below where they were last year. And so that more than balances out the savings in any negotiated contract costs for the remote Wednesdays, for the regular transportation piece anyway. And you'll see elementary, middle, and high school cost centers are less spent than they were in prior years. This is a timing issue from my perspective. So we haven't cut budgets here. I think the departments just haven't spent at the same rate. And we accelerated spending last year, partly due to the pandemic. So that was something that impacted last year more than this year. And lastly, in student services, our tuitions are largely in line with what we budgeted. I have spoken with Abby about this. She does think there are a couple of costs that haven't hit our expense line yet. There are a few placements for socio-emotional needs for students that she's seeing and starting to act on. And then there is a potential placement that might be costly, and that one could be up to 100K, and we're just watching to see whether that will occur or not. So those are some of the student services impacts. But so far we're on budget, I'd say. And contracted services we anticipated would be over budget in student services. That is there. Last year it was over budget by 340K. This year it is 684K. But the difference is all COVID related expenses. So we have looked at some of those drivers of additional contracted service expense, and it is COVID expense. We do see savings of 150K in special ed transportation. And that's partially due to the negotiated savings with our contracted service provider for special ed transportation and the model and the students. So that one's a complex one to really untangle, but we're happy that there is that savings. It helps us address some of the contracted service overage. So I've just thrown a lot of information at you, but I want to say there's a lot that I'm monitoring here. We also have not pulled out some expenses that will go to federal and state funds. So I've acknowledged earlier this year that the town has been very collaborative and has been working with us to apply $750,000 of CARES funding to help us pay for some of the technology purchases that we've made. We also have some funding that has come to us through the state. We haven't applied all of those sources yet. We will do that. Pam and I are working closely together, and we're monitoring the rules, and we're waiting to see the optimal ways to use funds. Each of those pots comes with strings attached, and we'd like to maximize what we get for Westwood by charging the right expenses to each pot. So that's the story there. I'm happy to take any questions you might have on this.
Well, that was my question. So there's 1.4 million. Does this account for the 1.4 million between the CARES and the state and federal that we're talking about? Or I don't want to say this, or is there maybe potential additional money that we can use for next year's fiscal budget that might come out of that 1.4 million that we haven't accounted for?
So there is there's a third iteration of funding from the federal government that we will get next year. I don't expect it to be significantly more than what we've seen this year. And our funding through those federal allocations has been smaller than the funding that's come through the state. So the state has had a per pupil rule when allocating funds, and that worked more favorably for us than the federal funding, which was tied to Title I. So as an example, the first round of federal funding, we got $20,000. The second round, we got 85. They were helpful, and I'm very grateful for everything we get, but they were less significant than a state round of funding at which we were given $675,000 because it came at $225 per pupil. So some of the state funding pots were more significant here.
But
So I guess,
oh, sorry, go ahead, Tony.
I mean, I guess my question is, do all these numbers reflect that money? I don't want to say spent, but like, do they reflect that 1.4 million between the CARES and the, whatever it's called, the federal and state? The numbers we just talked about.
Yeah, I haven't extracted,
Okay.
reflect that money spent yet. So it's good. I mean, in a way, this gets better when we apply those funds, and mechanically what we do is we take the expense. So for example, 100,000 spent on Chromebooks, and we move it from our budget and we move it to those funding sources. We haven't done that, which is good news.
Okay.
When you say that we're on track to close the year, you mean by applying all of that funding?
I do mean by applying.
Yeah.
But I would say
That's what I'm trying to understand. Yeah.
Right.
It does look good though, in the sense, so I'd say, I think in the first page of the report, you could see, overall other expenses category is overspent. It's at 117% spent. And contracted services is at 106% spent. So we're more than fully spent in those buckets. We'll be able to manage by partially moving expenses to these other state and federal dollars and leveraging that. Where I can, I would love to reserve some funds for next year. So the mechanism by which that works might be maybe using circuit breaker less than anticipated. So if this turns out to be a favorable year at the end, and so far it's looking good for closing the fiscal year in a solid way, if it continues to be favorable, we may be able to save some funding in circuit breaker and maybe use it less than what we anticipated to use it. That puts us in a strong position next year.
So I'm going to say it in a way that will drive Lemma crazy because it's not specific enough. But the way that I think of it is we have spent way more than we budgeted for. But luckily, there have been these other funding sources, and that's going to allow us to end the year in a good place. And, fingers crossed, maybe even have like a little bit to reserve towards next year. And the next round of federal stimulus money, I do want to clarify. I mean, it's a lot of money that's coming, but not to us. So the second round of ESSER funding, the Westwood Public Schools got, I think, 85 grand. And they told us to expect about 2.2 times that. So, it's real money, but I mean, it's less than $200,000. It's not, we're not getting millions of dollars from the federal stimulus. And that is because of what Lemma said, that it's the distribution formula is tied to Title I. So you'll see that other districts, are getting millions of dollars. So that's the picture.
Yep. I think you said it very well, Emily. That's exactly it. We spent a lot more than budgeted, but we have somehow, thanks to all of these different sources and to some areas where, activities were delayed, like athletics, we're looking favorable so far.
Any other questions on budget?
Thank you, Lemma.
Okay, I have two last quick things, and if you don't mind, I'm going to take them out of order.
Sure.
So I just want to give an update on where we are with Extended Day. I know the committee is aware of this, and I think we may have sent something out to the community today. I don't know. We did. Okay. So, as you know, over the last several months, the district's considered some options with regard to providing for and after school options for families next year. And at the school committee meeting in March, we had presented a proposal to investigate outside vendors as a way of sort of ensuring a smooth opening next year with adequate staff. And And, you know, we got some feedback from the committee about that and from the public. And I had said at the end of last meeting, we wanted to take some time to debrief that and to think it through. So following the meeting, we did draft an RFS, but we also sent a survey to families of students entering grades K-5, and we continue to weigh our options. So bottom line is, after further research and some considerations, we're opting to restart our extended day as a program that's run and managed by the district. You know, I think it was very clear to us that families value relationships that have been built with the staff at extended day, and we're in this unprecedented period of disruption, and we understand that that kind of stability seemed very important to people. So, you know, we hope very much that it'll be possible to secure sufficient staffing to restore the program. We have appointed an interim director who's very familiar with the program to start work immediately, basically this spring, and to run the program next year. So we do just need to give that individual a little more time to have some conversations that need to happen before we announce publicly who it is. But that person will be reaching out to families soon to begin the registration process for next year. So that's where we stand. I know I had updated the committee on that previously. And then just the last thing I wanted to do was very quickly take 2 minutes. You know, as a district, one of our priorities is to provide meaningful, authentic learning experiences for students. And that's been challenging in the COVID environment, but our teachers have really been very creative. And so I want to take literally 2 minutes tonight to share a video from that a high school science teacher made. And so this video is Greg Schwanbach, who's a high school science teacher and instructional technology coach at the high school. And he made this to share with the school committee to show you something that they use in astronomy called SLU. And he explains it better than I do. So here we go.
The problem with teaching astronomy at the high school level is that you can teach about astronomy, but you can't actually do astronomy. And that's because astronomy happens at nighttime and high school happens during the day. Now, we are able to do some observation nights. We have a telescope at the school, but they're hard to do. We can't do them frequently. The weather in Westwood and the light pollution in Westwood is not good for observation. So this year, we've introduced a technology called SLU, which has really solved this problem. Now, SLU is a paid service that lets students remotely control telescopes in the Canary Islands and in the Atacama Desert in Chile, both of which are premier observation sites in the world, and they give us coverage of both the northern and the southern hemisphere. So now when we're learning about a topic in class, emission nebulas, for example, students can go and make their own observation of something like the Orion Nebula. This picture was taken by a student back in January. Students are able to schedule their observations ahead of time, and the observation can happen asynchronously. So even if the observation is taking place at 2 or 3 in the morning, the students are able to get their images the next morning. Not all observations turn out great. The weather can interfere with a student's observation, even though the location of the telescopes minimizes that, as they're at altitudes that are usually above the clouds. But that's part of doing real astronomy, right? The weather messes up your plans. And this is really a good representation of astronomy as a whole, because astronomy these days, research-grade astronomy, is done with remotely operated telescopes like this. Real research astronomers will be in an office on a university campus or somewhere else, and they'll be instructing a telescope at a distant location in Chile, in the Canary Islands, in Hawaii, elsewhere, and telling that telescope what observations to make. So SLU is a piece of technology that's allowing my students at a high school level to do astronomy rather than just learn about it. If any school committee members or any members of the public watching this have any questions about SLU or astronomy in general, please shoot me an email. I love talking about it, and take care. Bye.
So I just wanted to share that with you. I would ask you to reserve your astronomy questions for Mr. Schwanbach, because I will definitely not be able to answer those. I did take one astronomy course in college, and I found it quite challenging. But I wanted to share that with you just because we talk so much about COVID data and logistics, and it's good every once in a while to sort of think about what's happening in classrooms. So thank you to Mr. Schwanbeck for making that video. He's an ITC, has some technology skills, as you can see as well with that.
That was great.
Production.
Thanks for sharing that. Yeah.
All right, that's it for me. Thanks.
Awesome. Okay. Thank you. That concludes the superintendent's report. At this time, we're going to move to public comment. This is the time when we open up the phone lines, if you will, to the public. The purpose of this portion of the agenda is to allow residents to pose questions or make comments pertaining to the Westwood Public Schools. This is an opportunity for the administration and the school committee to listen to the concerns of the public. I would ask members who participate to please provide us with your name and your street address. And Erica, if you could provide instructions on how folks can participate, and then I will call on the individuals as they raise their hands.
Sure. Once they raise their hands, I will be able to unmute them so they can speak, and then they can introduce themselves.
Okay, perfect. And I'm going to ask folks to please limit your comments to 3 minutes maximum, and we'll get started right away with Diane Hayes. Diane?
She can unmute now.
Unmute. Sorry. Okay. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you.
Oh, great. My name is Diane Hayes and I live at 84 Magnolia Drive. And I had a question. The district's priority this year has seemed to be getting children back in the classroom. We know that the pandemic is disproportionately affecting people of color and that students of color are more likely to be remote than their white peers. Has the district collected any data regarding the ethnicity of our remote students here in Westwood? And are we balancing the needs of our remote students equitably? And are we leaving behind our medically vulnerable students and families as we move forward?
Carol, I'd be happy just to speak to that. So we have, in fact, taken a look at the demographics of our fully remote students. That's something that we've looked at carefully. And I would just say that we certainly have no intention of leaving anybody behind. I know that there's a lot of question about what next year is going to look like. And I understand very much people's concern about that. What I have said is that in all likelihood, the fully remote model next year won't be the same fully remote model that we have this year. But we are thinking about how we're going to meet the needs of people who may still continue to need a fully remote option. So more on that to come as we make our way through the spring.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. The next, I see the Feingolds. You are next up.
Hi, I just wanted to say thank you very much for listening to the parents about Expended Day. Oh, can you hear me?
I'm sorry, can you just?
Oh, I'm sorry. Steph Feingold, 5 Whippoorwill Drive.
Thank you.
Oh, and I have somebody else who wants to say.
Oh, hi. Stephanie Feingold's son, and thanks for keeping Extended Day.
I think that says it all.
Good to hear from you. Thank you. Okay. Next up, I have Donna Morrison.
This is Donna Morrison, 303 Oak Street. I may have missed it because I had to tune in late. I was wondering what the percentage of students who are still in remote learning. I am a little disappointed in the numbers of teachers who are testing, that in fact, to learn that that's gone down to under 40%. I would have thought that that might have increased, especially with students returning to school. In that light, I would say that since school committee originally allocated close to $120,000 to test all administration and teachers to allocate that money toward any and all budget shortfalls and to halt student testing at this time, since the teachers don't feel that they need to be participating in that program any longer. Maybe they do feel that the vaccinations are taking care of it, but to have under 200 teachers participating at this time, I have a feeling that that's a lot of administration. I can't be sure of that, but I'm not certain. But I would say to move the money and halt the program. There are many more shortfalls that need addressing at this time. I had also hoped, in light of all the imploring for the school committee to return students back to school, that there would have been a higher participation in the student testing. So that just makes me sad to learn that participation amount isn't there. Makes me glad that the state will cover the cost of that so that you are not burdened by that. And so I just want to thank you for all the work that you've done this year. It's been really stellar on your part. And thank you very much for your time this evening.
Thank you, Donna.
Thanks. And I can tell Donna that right now about 7% of our students are fully remote.
Thank you very much.
Okay, next I have Mandy Taft-Pearman. Mandy?
Hi, thank you. Mandy Taft-Pearman, 723 Gay Street. Just wanted to voice public comment and support related to the DEI update topic, which I know is planned for later in this meeting. I'm one of over 200 parents or community members that signed a letter to this group a couple of months ago requesting your focus on issues related to DEI and anti-racism and equity efforts. And I just want to voice strong support for the curricular changes referenced, and also for some of the additional things that I believe and hope the district will be thinking about beyond curriculum in terms of the culture of the school, training and such for adults, hiring of increasingly diverse staff, et cetera. And for me, I think it's important for two important reasons. One is about ensuring that the district is meeting the needs for all kids and families in our district it's an increasingly diverse district. If you look at on any number of dimensions around race and ethnicity, around immigration background or current immigration status, LGBTQ, special needs, we just have an increasingly diverse district, and our number one job is to ensure that we're meeting the educational needs of all of those kids and families. And I think this work is critical to doing that. And then second is really about the education we're providing for all of our kids. An excellent education in the 21st century is one that I think equips kids to engage across lines of difference, to understand multiple perspectives, and to be well-versed and thoughtful about these topics. And I think it's in line with Westwood's commitment to doing the best it can by its kids and families to do this and to integrate it throughout. So I just want to voice appreciation for the work that's been underway. A hope that the school committee and the administration will continue to prioritize it and make investments in line with things I know are being considered around an equity audit and kind of a more holistic plan for the district on this front. I think that will be really essential going forward. I appreciate all that's been done it's still continued despite what you all have had on your plates this year. It's been a tremendous lift and see this as continuingly important. So thank you, and just wanted to voice support.
Thank you, Mandy, and also thanks to all. We received the emails from members of the community, and we appreciate your comments and input. So thank you for that. Next, I have Doris Forteith. Sorry if I mispronounced.
Hi, this is actually Thomas Forteith, Doris's husband. Doris is here with me.
Hi.
We're at 392 Oak Street. Thanks for giving the time to speak. I wanted to echo some of the things Mandy said, and I wanted to thank Emily for working to put forth diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives in the Westwood district. Speaking from a very personal point of view and from a professional point of view simultaneously. From the personal point of view, I am a member of a biracial family with a special needs child and have been very concerned with the lack of DEI initiatives in the district, and frankly, the microaggressions that we've experienced as a family in this town and within the schools. From a professional point of view, I'm a teacher of 25 years. I've taught for the last 15 years at Noble and Greeno School, and where we are in Westwood is shockingly behind the curve in terms of DEI work, in terms of the equity audit, in terms of affinity and allyship groups, in terms of culture, in terms of curriculum. And there's a lot of work to be done. So Emily, I want to thank you for taking us in that direction. It is very necessary. And I want to thank you too, specifically, Emily, for a comment you made in your letter about how important this work is developmentally in the elementary school level. It has to start there. And the notion that for some reason this might be inappropriate at that level is completely outdated, completely wrong, and completely pedagogically unsound. It has to start at the very youngest level. And I would finally say, in terms of the return to school for fall and the potential for remote option, that is a DEI issue. That is an issue around diversity, around equity, around inclusion, and frankly, around justice. And so we cannot separate those two realms. It is impossible to separate COVID, education, and DEI work. They are completely intertwined. So I hope that we'll continue to move forward in those areas and that the conversation will increase and that the change will increase at a very rapid pace. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Thanks for your comments. At this point, I think, oh, I have one more. At this point, Christina Martin.
Christina Martin, 23 Brookfield Road. I just also want to offer my strong support for diversity, equity, and inclusion work. And I think it needs to be a top priority. It has all my support. And I appreciate that in this kind of crazy year that we've had, I know you have still been thinking about it, but haven't perhaps been able to prioritize it, since keeping everyone alive has obviously been a top priority. But I do hope that coming in September, we'll be able to refocus on this, because I think it's of critical importance for not only all the students in the district, but also for teachers and staff. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I have Megan Brink. Megan?
Hi, this is Megan Brink, 47 Briar Lane. I wanted, with my CPAC hat on, to speak in support of providing a remote learning model for our most vulnerable special education students, and really any student that has a particular disability or diagnosis that makes COVID-19 particularly scary. And as a parent without my CPAC hat on, actually, or with it on, I'm in full support of the DEI work that's been presented. I've joined the anti-racism committee within Inclusive Westwood, and I'm fully behind all the work that they're doing. This is hard work that I've been doing as a parent within my own family. It's work I need to do with myself, and it's work I'd like to see echoed in the Westwood community. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Megan. I have Mike DiBenedetto.
Hi, I'm Michael DiBenedetto. I'm from 95 Tamarack Road. Wanted to add my support to other members who have spoken about DE&I, and recently begun to attend the meetings that have been held. And I think the most important thing that, I think Mandy said at one point, that the educational experience that we give to all the children in Westwood. So, I mean, I think we've moved to the community specifically for that. And I think that, a comment around how many people, we're not uncommon in that, right? People come to Westwood for an excellent education, but the fact that we come here for that there is this potential gap or spot that was not being addressed currently with a, affirmative plan, that is something that, we're looking to hopefully see and and I think the next steps of having this on this agenda tonight is a tangible next step, and I think it's appreciated by many people in the community. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay. I don't see any more. Mandy Taft-Pearman still has her hand. Oh, no, still has her hand up. Oh, not anymore. Okay. I think that concludes our public comment session for this meeting. Thank you all for your comments. And at this point, we're going to move to the liaison reports. Mayor Plotkin, would you like to give us an update on the building project?
Sure, I would love to. So last month, you'll recall I talked to you about the bridge funding and the construction, well, assuming a fall town vote, which we're hoping will happen this fall, and assuming that's a positive result, then starting construction in July 2022, moving through construction with a move-in date into the new building of February 2024 and completion in August of 2024. Completion meaning the fields are done, the parking lot's done, and the old building is gone, and the new building looks all pretty. 6 months, and with that delay, there's a couple consequences. First is an increase to budget, and second is an increase to the schedule. And to avoid those two delays, we are asking for this bridge funding, which is an amount of about $1.46 million. There's, the 2 points I want to make here is that this will not require an override. And also this amount will be sort of fronted from the amount we asked for in the fall. It won't add to the amount we're asking for in the fall. We'd actually take a portion of that and asking for it in the spring. But what this does do is allow our designers to continue to work through the summer, so that when we get that hopefully positive town vote in the fall, we're ready to go immediately with the bid documents out to bid and get the contractors on board and meet that construction start date of July 2022. So this will be on as a warrant article in town meeting this spring. The breakdown, I think the next slide might show the breakdown, Emily, or maybe, oh, well, this slide sort of highlights what I just talked about. The cost impact to the project of this delay I was talking about, if we didn't do this bridge funding, would be about $720,000. The two large components of that are a 3% annual escalation in construction costs, which given the rise in construction costs recently might even be a little too low, but that's what our estimators gave us. And also we need additional contingency because starting a project, delaying the start of construction from July to December could be a little more costly given the potential winter conditions and the delays that might stem from snow and sleet and not being able to work for certain periods of time. So this is how the bridge funding would work. This is the breakdown of it. Compass would have about $120,000 in fees. That's for them to continue working. This is our OPM, 6 months at about $20,000 per month. They also would have to get additional cost estimating services for about $17,000. And then Doran Whitterer would provide their basic services and their extra services. Extra services are just the consultants they need to hire to perform their work as well. So the total that we anticipate spending is about $1.45 million. We're asking for 1.46, just to round up. Again, this is a not to exceed number. We might not even spend that much, but this is the amount that we're asking to be allocated. And this is really an important warrant article for the project. We really would like to stick to that schedule. We really would like to keep the costs down as much as possible and to avoid a $750,000 additional cost. To us seemed worth it to put this article on the agenda for town meeting. So that's just a reminder of the warrant article. I encourage everybody, I don't know if I'm allowed to say this, but I encourage everyone to go to town meeting and listen to the presentations at town meeting and vote at town meeting. And I think are there any questions on this?
Maya, could I just add that since our last meeting when we discussed this bridge funding, the FinCom, the Finance and Warrant Commission, did hold its final public hearing, and the FinCom voted to support this warrant article.
Yes, thank you. Yes, that's an important point. FinCom has voted to support this article.
And it's in May 3rd. It's right. Is that correct? Monday, May 3rd is in.
Yes.
Is it it's at Flayhive?
At Flayhive outdoors, 5 o'clock.
5
Very
o'clock.
similar to last year.
Okay.
You know, hopefully the weather will be nice, and I think there aren't too many articles, I don't think, but you know, this is one of, you know, at least in my mind, this is an important one. So regardless of how you're going to vote, everybody should go to town meeting and really hear these presentations. And I actually think presentations will be available ahead of time for people to review. So you can watch it in the comfort of your own home and learn about it. And then at town meeting, it will be an abbreviated presentation. So definitely look for that coming out from the town.
I'm wondering, Maya, too, I think it might be a helpful idea for us to email out to our listserv the video of the community forum that we did in March, because that was really, it was like a soup to nuts presentation. What's the need for the project? How did we get here? What's the process been? How did we arrive at this? And, you know, we were thrilled that we had, I think, a couple hundred participants at it. It was great. I mean, I gave the presentation, but I think it was a good presentation. And so a lot of slides. And so I think it might be a good idea to send it out to folks, and it's a lot of information.
I think that's a great idea. I mean, all of the feedback we got from that presentation was that the start to finish presentation was really, really helpful, that we covered a lot of ground that people had forgotten about because it's been 2 or 3 years since we talked about it. And I think the information was presented in a way that was very manageable. So I think emailing out the link to that video, Westwood Media Center did record that for us. So emailing out the link to that video would be great. And people, again, can watch it at their leisure. I think the presentation itself is about 50 minutes, and then there's about 40 minutes of questions and answers. But I absolutely think it's worth a watch. Definitely.
Okay.
I'll do that.
Thanks, Maya.
Thank you.
All right, the COVID-19 Advisory Group update. Charlie Donahue or Tony Mullen, do you have an update for us?
Yeah, I'll be pretty short. So we are continuing to meet every few weeks. You know, I think people think with the return to full open that COVID has gone away, and unfortunately it hasn't. I think just a couple things from that recent meeting to reiterate. One was what the superintendent talked about. You know, we've good trends in testing, but we want to see continued more testing. So I'll encourage everyone to do that. You know, we also talked a little about the metrics. You know, I think at a statewide level, you know, with vaccinations, the good news is we're seeing, you know, a very good decline in hospitalizations and maybe a plateauing now, but we did see in deaths. We are seeing a higher percentage relative to even 2 months ago of under 18, which maybe you expect given the vaccination schedule, but that is something we just need to monitor. So getting back to the testing. And then I think we're just looking forward. We're starting to talk about what vaccinations might look like. It looks likely in the next, I think, couple weeks, actually, 16 and 17-year-olds will become eligible by the end of the month. I think everyone. So, you know, encouraging, you know, the older high school kids will be eligible, at least for the Pfizer vaccine. And it looks likely with some of the clinical trials that vaccinations for children, at least to the middle school age 12, will be probably available in the summer. So that's kind of what I'm starting to think about, but we're continuing to meet and kind of monitoring this, you know, and hopefully we'll continue to see some good trends and things will, you know, the public health outcomes will continue. But so I continue like to thank everyone on that committee for their volunteer time.
Okay, thank you.
I'd like to thank Tony also for all the work he's been doing with the committee, and we've come a long way. I think the testing that's going on is great. I also want everyone to remember these variants that are beginning to explode in Michigan and Texas and Florida. Could be another COVID that we need to watch, and that's why the testing we're doing is so important. The collaborative, we're very lucky now we have working with us Amanda Fairbanks, who is our testing coordinator, working with administration, and she's now getting involved in the collaborative. which is sharing all kinds of information, but all the towns and cities are having this issue of why aren't everybody getting permission for their kids to be tested? And they're trying to explore the reasons and create incentives or other ways we can get everybody tested, because ultimately it'd be nice to get up around 70–80% of people being tested, particularly if these variants come in, and they have started to come into Massachusetts. And the one thing they've said about the variants is that they're more explosive as far as infecting people, and they're more dangerous. So it's still a long way to go. And I think we're in a great shape to be in a position that we're in right now to take it on. So thank you again for all the people participating and working with Tony and the advisory committee and all of our teachers who are cooperating and the people doing the testing here.
Thank you, Charlie. We know
And when I saw when I was at the middle school recently meeting with Mr. Redmond, it was very exciting. He took me down to see the test. Maybe I got excited to see the testing going on, but it was exciting to see how efficient it was, and the kids were very willing to do the testing. So continue to encourage.
Thank you both. Charlie, we know you've been working tirelessly on this issue too. So Tony and Charlie, thanks for all the work you've been doing over the last several months on this. We appreciate it. Thanks for bringing it to us. Are there any other liaison reports at this time?
I have a CPAC update.
Okay.
So there's actually a lot of great things happening within CPAC. So there is a community meeting this Tuesday. And then on Wednesday, the 14th, there is a middle school transition workshop. And then parents within CPAC, a number of them are volunteering in doing some really great work across a few different areas. So one of them is expanding the Same and Different Like Me program, and it's to teach students about cognitive disabilities. Right now it's only happening in the 5th grade, so parents are trying to expand that earlier and later in school, meaning elementary and hopefully middle school. And then there's parents working with Westwood Rec to hopefully incorporate inclusion into the programs that they're offering. And lastly, there's a group that's collaborating with the Special Olympics to become a unified school district. So that seems really exciting. Right now, the high school, I believe, is the only school that offers that program. So the parents have been meeting with principals at the other schools to figure out how that might work at each respective school. And one example would be at the Thurston to have a unified PE offering. So that is all really exciting things, and I'm so grateful for all of the parents that are working on these important topics.
That's great. Thank you, Amanda. All right. Moving on to our discussion items. The first one is the strategic priority of diversity, equity, and inclusion curriculum. So
I'm going to turn over to Allison in just 1 minute here, but we're excited tonight to continue to talk about some of the work the district is engaged in around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I mean, obviously, as the committee knows, last spring, the school committee made a public statement, sent a letter to the community which voiced support for this work. And in that letter, you committed to guaranteeing equity for all students and continuing our work as a community to confront racism and move our educational mission forward. And so, the leaders and educators in this district share this commitment to equity and being an anti-racist district. We also recognize that we cannot do this work alone. And it was very, very heartening, very nice to hear from members of the public voicing support for the work tonight. Managing change, making change, particularly around complex issues that involve people's identities, is long-term work for the district and the community. And we know it'll be hard work, and we are excited to be engaged in it. So though we've been working on some important DEI initiatives, clearly the pandemic closure last spring and the need for different models this year did require us to turn our time and energy in some other directions. But we have worked hard to keep momentum going in this area. So Allison has updated school committee earlier in the year around some work we've been doing with hiring and professional development, but tonight she wants to share some work in the curriculum realm with you. And then at the end of the presentation, we also want to talk about some concrete next steps that we'd like to take to really to give the DEI work more coherence
and focus. So I'm going to turn it over to Allison.
Right. I'm going to attempt a fancy screen sharing thing. So give me just a moment here to figure out where my presentation is. Can you all see that slide? And can you see my notes? Okay, good. I think we're in good shape then. So I need to move you all to. So first off, thank you. I'm excited to be here to kind of share more information with you. And I'm particularly excited right now because as our students are sort of returning to school and things are starting to feel a little bit more like normal school, it feels like we're at a point where we can start to really turn more of our time and attention to this really important priority and other priorities that have to do with teaching and learning and the well-being of our kids. So it's a nice place to be. All right. So I want to say, just as a reminder, back in 2018, we identified the following as a priority. It's to implement programs and instructional practices that recognize and support the needs of students and families in an increasingly diverse community. And I'd say that, from 2018 until now, it's a priority that's taken on even more of a sense of urgency, both in Westwood and in the nation as a whole, given the context of ongoing challenges of racism in our country. And, all of us, I think, as individuals and as members of civic institutions like schools are trying to figure out how do we do this work of living up to the ideals of being the kind of nation that is a just and fair place. So, in January, I provided this sort of brief high-level update about where the district is with regard to this priority. Broadly, I spoke about how we're looking to move from actions that are well-intentioned but kind of scattered to a more strategic and focused approach. And these are sort of the broad categories that we talked through. I'm going to run through these slides very briefly. I'm not going to kind of give you all the gory details again, but I just want to sort of jog your memory about some of that content so you have it fresh in your mind. So in that sort of bucket of things that we've been doing with very good intention, but in maybe a less organized way than we'd like, included a lot of things around curriculum and instruction, around school and district culture, and around recruiting, hiring, and retention of staff. So there were updates to classroom libraries, Cortex, lots of professional development, some great events and speakers, and the formation of different groups. The district has joined multiple organizations that are aimed at helping us with our hiring practice, and also started affinity groups for staff. This is all recap. In our kind of thinking about shifting, this intentional shift from work that is sort of well-intentioned but less strategic than we'd like, we talked about a few factors. One is leadership team training, and I'm happy to report we've kind of been through one wave of that. The district's administrative council, which is comprised of the district leaders plus school principals and school administrators, has been through a round of leadership team training. That same type of training with a little different wrinkle that's more geared toward curriculum leaders is going to be offered in the coming weeks, as well as some training about hiring. We talked a little bit about working with the Department of Education, which has run this really great 2-year program that we've been members of, faithful members of, around staff diversification. And that program's been a huge learning experience for the group that's involved. They've just given us a lot to think about and work on. And particularly around this idea of using a more data-informed approach to staff diversification. We talked about a possible equity audit. I'll cycle back to that at the end. And then also thinking about processes we might use once we're able to identify things within the context of that audit that we can come back to and have a kind of efficient process for school improvement. And finally, I shared some examples of the types of tools that we were looking at and using for self-assessment and the types of data that we were starting to look at. That's my very quick recap. So today I want to cycle back to the topic of curriculum. The committee had specific questions about where we are in this work. And this presentation is designed to give you some sense of that. I want to acknowledge that there have been changes across all classrooms and departments and in many, many places throughout the district. Here, I'm really focusing on two areas because they sort of fit in with that framework of thinking about change that is more systemic and strategic. So our English language arts curriculum and literacy curriculum, that's the most recent review of a core curricular area that we've completed. And one of the core findings in that review related to DEI work. And so I want to kind of report out about where we are with that and how it's going. And the other I want to talk about is social studies, because we were sort of midway through review, got shut down by the pandemic. We're about to restart, but even though we hadn't made it all the way through to implementation and recommendations yet, the different levels have started sort of making some efforts and movements in this direction. So I think that the changes I'm trying to highlight here are things that I think are sort of systemic and across grade levels and classrooms, so that they're more reliable than something that's sort of going to be different classroom to classroom. Before we kind of dive into the substance of it, I wanted to share this quote, which I love. And it comes from a scholar, Rudy Sims Bishop, and I will give folks a moment to read it. I think that what's interesting about this to me is these are words from 1990. And Dr. Bishop's words do a couple things here that are interesting. One is, she's talking about text selection primarily. I think that there's broader application beyond just text selection. And it really reinforces this notion that what we choose to teach and how we choose to teach it make a real difference in terms of how our students learn and grow. And that matters for all of our students, those from groups who have been traditionally marginalized or underrepresented, as well as those who have not. So she makes a real case around texts, but I think it's also applicable to other types of content and curriculum. Okay, another piece of this I wanted to touch base on is terminology. So there are terms you may hear from educators or other people who are talking about education related to what's going on in curriculum instruction. And some of these are more broadly related to efforts in society at large. And I think this is notable because when I first started in the classroom more than 25 years ago, the thing that people were talking about, the thing that Dr. Bishop was talking about was multicultural education. And the focus on that time was certainly on representation, but it was a lot about celebration. Like, the world's this wonderful, diverse place. Since that time, there have been real advances in neuroscience that have helped us see that culture and emotions and relationships are things that play a really important role in learning processes. So the work of doing DEI work isn't just a thing we do in a kind of like everybody hold hands and it's a small world kind of way. It's actually really important in terms of helping children learn and overcoming what we see as persistent inequalities. So 3 terms I wanted to highlight. One is that idea of culturally responsive. And text selection is an example of where we would really aim to be culturally responsive, but applies to classroom practices. And it's an approach to teaching that incorporates characteristics of and knowledge from students' cultural backgrounds as an instructional strategies and course content. Anti-bias is another word you'll hear related often to training or sometimes to curriculum. And it's really developing an awareness, particularly for our educators, in how the learned beliefs and stereotypes out there about a particular group can impact an individual's treatment of that group, resulting in either preferential or harmful treatment. And so anti-bias training is an important component of the work we need to do so that we are really thinking about fairness and thinking about our choices of curriculum carefully. And finally, I think the term that I think is out there more now than you've ever possibly heard before is this notion of anti-racist. And I think it's very important to clarify when we're talking about anti-racist, we're not talking about, we're not only talking about handling individual issues that come up, so not isolated events of racism. So this isn't about behaviors from individual people. It's more about what are the policies and systems in place that might perpetuate opportunity gaps that we have for different groups of students. So a great example of this is to think about, you know, we're currently thinking about examining how we do recruiting and hiring, and are the types of questions we ask, for example, the types of job postings we have, are those sort of past practices and systems really doing the work we need them to do to bring in a more diverse staff, or are they kind of turning people away from us? So it's a really systems-based look at what's going on in education. So I wanted to share those. You may already be familiar, and if so, I apologize, but this is stuff that we are starting to talk about and going to talk about a lot more as a district. So, all right, now we'll get to the good stuff here. So Westwood High School's English department has tackled some text diversification in a very sort of thoughtful and meaningful way. And this was a major recommendation that came out of the review. I've just given you sort of a sampling of some of the updated texts, and these are all different kind of primarily novels. There's some nonfiction there as well. And along with the sort of infusion of some new texts into the curriculum, the department has also really looked at their essential questions. Those are sort of guiding questions that they keep coming back to in a course to touch upon and think about. And they're really designed to be questions that promote sort of deep thinking for kids. And an example here is considering racial and social inequalities. How does American education either empower or stifle personal growth? It's probably something we should all be thinking about a lot. I also want to let you know in the grade 10 curriculum, they've started to make some updates and are looking for a fuller shift so that it's a more representative world literature curriculum starting next fall. In looking at their text list, they found it was very European in terms of the authorship. And if we're going to do a world lit course, it really should be a world lit course. So that's a big shift that's taking place. They've also put in place some senior elective offerings. These are really designed for kids who want to dive deeper into issues around identity that come up in literature. So these two new senior electives are courses for kids who want to hear about traditionally underrepresented voices. So there's one on race and culture and one on gender and orientation. Finally, I'm not going to say too much about this because I think it's a work in progress, but there is a plan around summer reading. I think there is some talk around a full school summer read option that would be kind of in line with a kind of culturally proficient lens or culturally responsive lens. And people are excited about it, but I'm going to keep the cat in the bag for now until they've confirmed. That's a little bit about high school English. High school social studies. Now, remember, we're kind of midstream of the review. So what's great, I really want to give the social studies department credit. They kind of got out in front a little bit, in part because of some changes in the state framework. But they started the process already of updating some guiding questions and some content in grades 9 and 10. So grade 9 world history, for example, is tackling this question of how do diverse societies respond to common problems. And they've expanded their unit on the African kingdoms and trade empires. That's that sort of right around the Middle Ages time. There are these sort of great kingdoms in Africa that were very influential in different parts of the continent. They're also looking at the Columbian Exchange and transatlantic trade and the legacies of those sort of moments in time, as well as a new unit on racism in America. You know, it's a great sort of study of like what happens in a nation when you're and how is this nation solving this issue, and how might other nations be doing it differently. In modern history, the core question is about how modernization has created whether modernization has created a more just world. And they're looking at some really interesting case studies there that I've listed as well. In grade 11, so those were kind of projects that teams of teachers were working on over the past 2 years. Grade 11 is not quite as far along yet, but they're anticipating getting there over this summer and into next year. So the US history course is also going to update some of their essential course questions. And an example of the type of thing they're thinking about is traditionally when they've taught the civil rights unit and the civil rights struggle, they've focused a lot on the South and Dr. King and the movements there. They want to take a more nationwide approach and particularly look right here in our backyard at the busing crisis in Boston. And finally, I wanted to point out that social studies across all levels, the high school in particular, really draws on primary sources. So unlike when I went to school where we were sort of slogging through a textbook, kids are looking at texts and speeches and photos. And a couple examples of the photos that they'll be looking at are here. The top is from the Boston Globe story, 1974, about busing and busing in South Boston. And the bottom is from Manzanar, which if you're not familiar, is the camp where American citizens of Japanese descent were detained during World War II. I'm going to turn to the middle school now. And in English language arts, sort of similarly to the high school, they're trying to diversify text across a lot of grade levels. And here, because fewer novels are taught and more short stories and poems, we're seeing more diversification in those areas. So you'll see some photographs of authors as well as some covers of books. A key difference here too is the course essential question actually runs across all 3 grade levels, and it's the question of why writers write. So it's not about sort of human themes as much as it is about sort of this meta theme that's more instructional. And what's kind of cool about diversifying text is that when you do that and talk about why writers write, you get a much more kind of interesting conversation. What are people writing about? Why are they writing? What are the themes they bring to the table? Like the high school, the middle school has a plan they're working toward for summer reading. I believe their plan actually involves choice from among a number of different books. And the books are going to be from authors from traditionally underrepresented groups. And along with a student kind of book option, they're also looking to do a book group for adults. The PTO has expressed real interest in having a book group, voluntary book group. It's not mandatory for middle school parents, but we'd love it if people showed up. And they are looking to read the book Cast by, I want to say, Isabel Wilkerson. Might get my names tangled, but really excellent book. The 8th grade for a long time has engaged in a Holocaust literature study, and that is ongoing, and felt important to put on the table as well as part of this effort. And that it felt important to say out loud today too, in light of Remembrance Day. And finally, both in language arts and in social studies, there has been a lot of focus on the notion of a democratic discussion in class, which they've taken great pains to distinguish from a debate. A debate I'd like to say is kind of like an intellectual competition. You're really trying to win the day and score points. And their approach has been to try and shift from that, because sometimes what that leads to is people saying things that they may or may not believe, but for effect. And instead, having students really learn to talk to each other about issues and talk about areas where they might disagree. I got to sit in on one of these recently where kids had really grabbed onto this phrase, I'd like to respectfully disagree with so-and-so. And I think I heard it like 15 times in the course of this class. And it was just heartwarming. I thought, if we could all learn to do that, the world would be, I think, an easier place to be for sure. And the goal of it isn't to score points or isn't to sort of win the day. It's really just to learn to express yourself, learn to listen carefully, and learn to sort of take into consideration what other people are saying. Middle school social studies Kind of similarly to the high school, we're still partway through the review, so it's not as much change as I think we all anticipate in the days ahead. But in grades 6 and 7, which is sort of a 2-year band of world history, they have really shifted so that they're trying to do more to tie the past to the present. And they've got this sort of overarching question about how the past has helped to shape the present. The way the courses work, it kind of bounces from continent to continent and time period to time period. So it sort of just moves around the world and looks at kingdoms in Africa and also at the Middle East and the impact of colonization on those two areas. The Middle Ages, they take a deep dive into East Asian religions and look at trade and climate in Oceania. And I think the hope is that those topics can come more to life if we can connect them to current events that have some sort of causal back chain. You know, if we think about some of the challenges of conflict in the Middle East and being able to look back at what was going on, you know, years and years ago, and how does that lead up over time. So far, the most profound changes we've seen, I think, anywhere in social studies are actually 8th grade. So a couple years ago, with the adoption of the new state frameworks, there's a shift, and the 8th grade course used to be just a sort of straight up US history class that ran from the colonial era up through the Civil War and Reconstruction. And the state has really revised the standards. And so now it's a focus on civics and civic education. It's on US government, you know, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, government processes. And our core essential questions have changed. One, there are several for the class. One example is, how do we understand our role as citizens in protecting the promises of a democratic society, which is a great question. Our 8th grade teachers have all gone through training through an organization called Primary Source, and they have worked up this program called Democracy Lab that is basically helping teachers kind of revise curriculum and have this sort of civics oriented approach that ends and will be ending this year for the first time in a really robust civic action project. I think we'll be slightly hampered this year in a way we might not be down the road by COVID. I'm hoping that these projects are really, really cool this year, but also that they'll be even cooler in years ahead. And I linked to the, I'm gonna see if I can figure out how to get this to you in the chat. Hold on. This is a kind of a document that actually goes through the contents of the Democracy Lab program and some sample lessons. And I think I have the power, I believe, to pop this in the chat, which I am going to try and do. Well, maybe I don't right now. I will get it into the chat once I'm out of present mode. But it's like 26 pages, so I can't show you the whole thing right now. It's worth taking a look at. It's got some really interesting content in it. And it's, in addition to doing some upfront professional development, the Democracy Lab folks have been there to provide some ongoing support for teachers as we kind of work through the details of the civic action project. So I'd say elementary is the place where I think we have the most work ahead. And honestly, it comes down to the fact that it's the place where there was the most sort of variation classroom to classroom in these two areas of literacy and social studies. So we have traditionally, given teachers a fair amount of room in terms of text choice, in terms of approach to different types of topics. And so coming out of the literacy review, the main recommendation from that review, first and foremost, was to try and come up with a backbone approach to curriculum so that no matter what classroom you are in the district, that we had a kind of guaranteed set of experiences and skill sets so that kids would coming out with stronger reading and writing skills. And in order to make that leap, we invested in a program that's very highly regarded for pedagogical reasons. It's the Units of Study in Reading and Writing. It was developed by a team out of Teachers College Columbia, so the Teachers College Reading and Writing Project. And I'd say the upside is that it has some really great instructional strategies baked in, really good teacher tools that the teachers kind of learn to use and language. I would say the weakness of the program was in their texts. So the text sets that were used with this program and the units of study and were not as diverse as they needed to be. Fortunately for us, the reading and writing project folks realized this, and they have started the process of revising those text sets and making new recommendations. And that's great work. We're also doing some of that work internally. So we've swapped out some of those titles already with other titles that have a more kind of culturally responsive approach. So that's a little bit about where we are. We actually, I feel like, made some progress in terms of that alignment of curriculum classroom to classroom this year, honestly, thanks to COVID, which is a strange thing to say out loud. The very fact that, you know, the challenges of teaching in this environment meant that our teachers were more reliant on the literacy team to kind of push things out. And I think that that's going to actually set us up and more reliant on each other. There was some really great teamwork that happened across schools. So the first grade team would all meet together on Zoom and talk about how they were going to do different things. And so those sort of structures and that kind of cohesiveness, we're looking to move forward and then continue with working on the DEI lens here too. Social studies is the area, I would say our greatest growth area is elementary social studies. The reviews in progress, there is no kind of common curriculum resource in social studies. They're sort of a kind of hodgepodge of things in different grade levels for different people, depending on the topic. And one of the main recommendations that I think is going to be coming fast and furious is some kind of backbone curriculum so that we can build that consistency that we need. We have done some work this year to try out some things that are out there in the universe, including Newsella and Kids Discover, which are online resources, as well as this kind of cool resource called History's Mysteries. It's actually created through a Library of Congress grant and does a lot of work with little kids and primary sources. So lots of photographs that they get to look at and figure out. And they're taking this sort of mystery approach, which is cool. The thing I would say about it that's also interesting, sorry, I'm having allergies. I swear they're allergies. The authors of the program are fairly intentional about trying for a culturally responsive frame. So this is a curriculum that baked into it is an attempt toward that. I don't think it's perfect. You know, we've had a team of people look at it, but one of the things that we're hoping to fast track as we get back to the review this spring is some kind of recommendation about curriculum resources. I'd love to put something in people's hands in the fall so they can have something to start with. So I know the kind of core of this is really about curriculum, and I've talked through sort of where we are in these two big areas. I wanted to mention this notion of co-curricular work because, you know, we used to call these activities extracurricular, sort of outside the classroom. And that renaming to co-curricular is a really intentional change. And I think it kind of honors the fact that for many kids, a lot of their most sort of powerful learning, you know, I hate to say this as the assistant superintendent of schools, but I'm going to say it. So here you go. A lot of their most powerful learning does happen outside the classroom. It happens, you know, in their activities and their sports and in their connections to other kids. And I think one of the hardest parts about COVID is that it's really impacted our ability to have these types of programs. But one that has been going strong and has really made, I think, an incredible difference for kids is the Let's Talk About Race, Culture, and Ethnicity group at the high school. You can see the group's goals that are articulated there, and also a quotation from one of the advisors about kind of what the work is that they're doing. And also some really important achievements. So about 60 students have joined this in grades 9 to 12. They've created an Instagram account. They've facilitated a guest speaker visit. They held roundtable discussions for their peers in the wake of events that people found really troubling. You know, the riots that happened in DC and the, you know, the wave of violence against Asian Americans. And, you know, in response to those events, a particularly vivid example of how this works, I think one of the members of the group, who is a senior, wrote an essay about anti-Asian hate in America, and her statement was so powerful, we shared it with the district and ultimately with the entire community. And it's kind of a prime example of how something that's not a class has an impact on a kid, and they're sort of thinking and learning and can have a broader impact on an entire community. The kids involved in Let's Talk About Race also really advocated for the formation of affinity groups. And affinity groups are just places for people who are underrepresented in the community to come together and connect with each other as self-identified members of a group, where they can kind of share and talk about their experiences, feel a sense of connection, and maybe even work on something that they're seeing as a concern or problem. And then finally, this high school group is now going to kind of head to the middle school and work on helping get a group, kind of comparable group up and running at the middle school level. I also think, making curricular change that's lasting and meaningful really can't happen unless there's some professional development involved. All of us, if we're going to try and tackle new things, need to learn stuff to do that. And I want to acknowledge this has been a major challenge of the year. We have had professional development time for sure, but a very substantial portion of that time has had to be devoted to things that are related to the situation we're in now, to helping people learn to use remote tools and to navigate the hybrid and to navigate the transitions from one model to another and figure out how to work together and plan together. I'd say the second challenge of PD when you think about these types of issues is that, Zoom is fine, but it's really doesn't hold a candle to meeting in person if you're going to be talking about things that are hard. And I think that, we've done it anyhow, but we really do look forward to a time when we can actually have people in conversation in the room together. And I think it'll help us move along as a district. Some of the things we have managed to do here, we've had school-based professional development around those democratic discussions at the middle school. So making sure every teacher gets a chance to sort of think through and practice how to navigate those as a classroom teacher. And a similar offering at the high school, very specifically about talking about race. We've gotten our leadership team trained through an organization called Ideas, and I always forget all the parts of there. It's up there on the slide. I always forget what the acronym stands for. But we also have recruited a team of representative teachers from throughout the district, and we're sending them to some training as kind of ambassadors, and we're hoping to kind of form them into an equity team that can help us do some of the ongoing professional development work. They are some of the folks who have gotten groups started at the schools individually and who are really excited about this work. Finally, our district has offered some really great courses in-house for our teachers that have been very well attended. And I want to show you an example from one of those in a second. One thing I don't have on the slide, but I want to mention, we have a weekly email newsletter to the district, to all staff in the district. And if you look back this year, it's actually pretty remarkable. Almost, I would say every, 2 out of 3 of every Monday memo that we've sent this year has had some opportunity for people to get involved with professional development that relates to culturally responsive education, anti-racist education, or anti-bias training. So it's been a kind of drumbeat that we are beating all year long, and many people have taken us up on it. They've attended webinars or even signed up for classes. So here's a great example for you. One of our faculty-led PD courses was a course called Exploring Self and Social Awareness to Create an Anti-Bias Curriculum for Students. And the co-instructors were Latifa Frank, who's our MECO director, and Erin Kuhn, the SEL coordinator. And they were really looking at that intersection of where sort of anti-bias and anti-racist work in SEL meets. thinking about this as a skill set that our kids need in order to kind of go out in the world and be good citizens in the world. One of our instructional technology coaches at the elementary school took a look at some of the Scratch lessons and realized there was an opportunity here to do some things around, debunking stereotypes, which is an important thing to do when we're talking about coding. The world of coding, as much as I think we're trying, is still very dominated by mostly men and, mostly white men in this country, at least. And I think we want to sort of start to move and get more kids, more girls interested. So this ITC found this great book. And if you need to pick me up, go home and Google the book, Astro Girl. And there's an author who has a read aloud in YouTube, and it is delightful. And what I love about this book is it kind of turns stereotypes on their head a little bit. It's a really positive kind of view of the idea of, how people influence each other to get into something like being an astronaut. So really charming. So what's ahead for the district? I think we have some really big things ahead. Firstly, I think we have some community outreach to do. You heard from some members of the community tonight. We've heard from many members of the community tonight who have just a lot of different feelings about this work. And I think we need to engage in some listening. We've talked about setting up listening tours where we go to the elementary schools, middle school, and high school to just hear, particularly from parents, about what are their experiences like, what have they been like in the Westwood Public Schools, and what do they hope for? What do you want? And what can we try and do differently? We're thinking we'll work with somebody, maybe an outside facilitator for those different series, and that's in part so that those of us who are in that sort of district role can just really truly listen carefully, and have somebody else do the conversation guiding. We also are looking to do some partnering. We've joined in the town's initiative. The town administrator started a human rights task force with an explicit mission of looking at how do we make the town of Westwood a more welcoming and inclusive place. We'd also like to think about partnering with Youth and Family Services, and I've had some conversation with Danielle Sutton around this work. Talking about these issues is hard, and I think we're struggling with wanting to do that really well, and I think many parents do too. Many parents are fearful of bringing topics up for kids, and there's this sort of art to being honest and direct and truthful in a way that also makes that truth manageable for kids developmentally. So I think Kate DiCamillo is one of my favorite authors, says that about great children's authors. They tell the truth and make it bearable, and that's a really critical practice. So our folks in the mental health universe, they are really good at this. They've been at it for a long time, and we'd love to join with them and really work together to support kids and families on that front. We've also talked about participating in an equity audit. And what an audit does is it gives us information about the degree to which our kind of policies and practices are fair. And it's, sometimes an outside group that can come in and do boots on the ground work. Often these days, it's like a tool, some sort of online tool or format. The two organizations we're kind of looking at intently right now, one is called Beloved. They're out of New Orleans. And the reason they're particularly interested is that through our affiliation with Metco, we have the opportunity to participate in their equity audit work for free. So that is appealing for sure. Another group is MAEC, which is the Mid-Atlantic Equity Consortium. And they also have some really robust resources. And I've been in conversation with some other districts about their experiences with equity audits. And this is one that came highly recommended. Both of these organizations work not just with schools, but with businesses and non-for-profits, other types of entities. And I actually think that's very important because sometimes that outside perspective can really help us think about things differently. So a group that has a broader lens can be very helpful to us. Additional steps, we need to finish the social studies review. We've got some meetings teed up for the spring. My hope is that that series of meetings can lead to some preliminary recommendations that allow us to kind of get moving. And then we would wrap up with the kind of final complete set of recommendations in the fall. And then we have more work to do around staff training. I've given you some examples of that, but ongoing work will be needed in terms of thinking about bias, thinking about stereotype, and really understanding what culturally responsive practice looks like and how do we meet the needs of kids here. So I'm a big fan of Zaretta Hammond, and she published a book a couple years ago called Culturally Responsive Teaching in the Brain. And I think her quote kind of gets at the heart of when people talk about anti-racism, what do they mean? And this is kind of what it comes down to. She says, in recent years, there's been a lot of talk about the reasons behind low performance of many students of color, English learners, and poor students. Rather than examine school policies and teacher practices, some attribute it to a culture of poverty or different community values toward education. The reality is that they struggle not because of their race, language, or poverty. They struggle because we don't offer them sufficient opportunities in the classroom to develop the cognitive skills and habits of mind that would prepare them to take on more advanced tasks. That's the achievement gap in action. And I'd say that what that means for us kind of fundamentally is, as a district, we need to focus on making changes to those existing systems and structures that perpetuate our inequalities and achievement gaps. We need to make our curriculum and instruction more culturally responsive. We need to redesign our processes for recruiting and hiring educators so we can be more fair and inclusive. We really want to listen to students and parents and community members and take steps toward creating a more welcoming culture where all of our students and our families and our staff can really feel like this guy, like they have a sense of belonging. And that's what all this is about. So I appreciate your time, and now you know a little of what we're working on. I said I would put something in the chat, so let me come out and see if I can do that.
Allison, can I just thank you for that? Can I just jump in and say that in terms of those concrete next steps, the timeline that we're talking about is that we would like to start those listening sessions this spring. Probably we'll have to complete them in the fall, and then the equity audit is something that we're looking to do in the fall. And we think those things will be really important as we, then articulate some clear goals, some outcomes and indicators, and can articulate that for the school committee and the community.
Thoughts, questions?
So I would share something in the chat, but there is no chat button, so I'll just have to send that link out some other way. I'm sorry.
So thanks, Allison. This was a great presentation. I think what's clear is that a lot of thought has been put into this, but there's a lot of work to do. And I think we're all acknowledging that, or at least I can't speak for you. I'm acknowledging that. I think that the good news is that I feel like we're now going in the right direction with this. I think that, the curriculum piece is super important. And I've always said, that's something we can control. It's, and that's certainly something we should look at. I think that what's become apparent to me is that, and I think Mandy may have even mentioned this, that this really needs to be a holistic approach, that we need to look not at these silos, right? Not just at curriculum and at programming, but at really sort of, and this is the hard work, right? This is the hard work, is to kind of do this work so that it's cohesive throughout the day, right? And that it doesn't start at 8 in the morning and end at 2 when class is dismissed. it's, so I sort of look at that with this lens and all the work that we're doing. And I think we are doing that. And I want to commend you for moving in that direction. But I just wanted to iterate that, to me, that's sort of the component of this, that this work is not siloed into various buckets, and that we sort of say, okay, well, we checked the curriculum bucket and we checked the programming bucket. I think we really need to, and I think the equity audit will be super helpful for that. I'm really excited about that. I'm really looking forward to seeing it. But all in all, I feel like we're going in the right direction. We've got a lot of work to do, and but I'm confident we have the right team to do it.
Right. And to your point, Maya, too, I would add that this is it's a tremendous commitment. It's, this is an initiative, like Maya said, that we started, and we have a ways to go, but it also should be townwide. And it, we have you made mention of the human rights, we called it the Human Rights Committee back years ago. And the fact that that committee has been resurrected, we should have a liaison to that committee from the school committee. And we should be working with the other boards in town. Everybody should have a part in this. It's not just the schools, but beyond. So, but yeah, thanks for, there's a lot of great information, Allison. Appreciate that presentation.
Thank you so much, Allison. Thank you for running through all the curriculum. That was incredibly helpful to see kind of where we are and where we're headed. And it's also exciting from my perspective. And Carol, in terms of that, the Human Rights Task Force, I'd be happy to volunteer from the school committee to be the liaison for that.
That's
I've
great.
been along those lines, I've been trying to think of what we could do within our roles as school committee members to try to kind of facilitate some of this work. Obviously, most of it falls to the leadership and the educators, but I keep coming back, and I think some community members have brought this forth too, is how great it would be if we had like values that we kind of all agreed upon, published, related to anti-racism and our dedication to DEI work, with some concrete action items. Like, I know the Mass Association of School Committees put out a template over the summer I've shared with some of you. We could use something like that as a guide to just kind of outline, like, very high level in advance of the equity audit, the steps that we're hoping to take. So that was one thing I was thinking, and I'd be happy to work with whomever on that. Something that, as a committee we could do to try to move this forward, and also show our teachers support, because if there's anything that we can do to help them as they kind of work through this and learn and educate the kids, if there's anything we can do to support them, I'm all for that. So
Allison, I'd like to congratulate you for all the work you've done and the people you've worked with to put this together. It's a tremendous accomplishment. It's almost overwhelming to look at it all. I agree with what Carol said, is that we should take advantage of the Town Human Rights Task Force, which in the development of the town plan, there are quite a few people speaking up and developing the town plan about why we are not, as a town, more interested in diversity and equity. And matter of fact, I think if we could get our agenda before that group, asking for their input, and make sure all of the different groups that we would like to have. I'd like to have teachers on that committee, and maybe administration on that committee, and clergy and others. But as we get into difficult times, ask their opinions and their thoughts on some of the things that we're getting into. I brought up a harebrained idea not too long ago, but 40 years ago, somebody had this idea that wouldn't it be great if inner city kids could go out and benefit from the suburban schools, and Medco was developed. And I often wonder, as we're talking about recruitment of people, could we maybe take the initiative in looking into 2-year exchanges of teachers, where inner city school teachers came to Westwood and taught here, and some of our teachers went into the inner city and they exchanged, as a way of, maybe before we actually hire people, could we do something like a Medco program, but with teachers, taking advantage of that? I also feel that the topics are so important. My greatest hope is complete success that all of these things go through and all of the programs we're talking about being introduced succeed. However, following politics for the last 65 years, the last 4 years have been a big disappointment by debate not really being legitimate, a lot of people having crazy ideas. So what we need to do as a school committee is to think through, how do we protect our teachers? How do we protect these ideas from what I think is going to be a lot of opposition with regard to issues of diversity, equity, and inclusion? And so I think we do need to think that one through carefully. What can we do to protect our teachers who bring things up in school? I was aware of a teacher when I was young, the most popular teacher in this high school, and during the Vietnam War, he brought up a debate, and he almost lost his job. Certain people in the community went nuts. They had, public is really a disaster. So what I'm concerned about is how, as we're thinking this thing through, we're creative in protecting our teachers in what they're saying and what they're doing. And I think this townwide task force could be of great help in running some ideas by them. What do you think? What are your comments on? But I do think we need to begin to think about those things. The second thing is some of these courses, the democracy lab, if school committee members could participate with the teachers, and maybe the town select board participate, opening up some of these ideas to the town officials wouldn't be a bad idea. I'd be happy to see what I could do, offer my comments. But I think about educating more than just the teachers. There's a lot of people out there that could benefit from this and maybe offer some ideas of their own. But I'm wishing you the greatest success, try to do everything I can. But I do think it's taking on these issues in today's environment, which is far different from the last 65 years, where things are now a little crazy out there. And to take these topics on and do well with them requires at least that kind of consideration, that we're prepared on all the possible opposition and differences of opinion to make sure it's a success. But thanks so much for what you're doing.
Yeah, thanks. Just one final thing. So I know it's getting late. So Allison, thanks again for everything. Two quick comments. I thought a lot about the equity component of DE&I, particularly in the last 12 months in the context of Westwood. So I think there is something to infuse upon here around. I mean, of course, we're blessed, but just infusing on how really blessed we are. And the equity component is really, I think, even in the midst of COVID, come to really light on the inequities. So I really infuse that on that. And then, not for tonight, there were a lot of comments about, there were several comments in public participation about remote learning in DE&I, and I was a little surprised by that. I'd be interested, there's emerging research about what the remote option is meant for the achievement gap. It's not for tonight, but I'd be interested in hearing from you about whether or not the remote option has actually helped narrow or widen the achievement gap. But that's a longer conversation, I know. But I just wanted to at least acknowledge that comment tonight.
I could just throw out, so Charlie said something about sort of everybody learning together. And I did just want to mention, for what it's worth, that the training, the leadership training that the Administrative Council did through ideas, it was something called anti-racist decision making. And we found it, very helpful. And I did ask the facilitator, is that work that he does with school committees as well? And the answer is yes. So I just sort of wanted to throw that out there to the committee, that if that's something that you would be interested in doing, we would be happy to arrange for that. It might be interesting for all of us and for you to have gone through a similar experience as we head into this work. So I don't necessarily need an answer at the moment, but it's something I think to consider.
I think it's a great idea.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, to Charlie's point, it is a polarizing environment that we live in. There's no doubt, but I think what we need to remember is that part of education is discussion, and I think that it's really important to have these discussions and to introduce these discussions, and part of education is learning how to have these discussions, period. So you know, I think while it will be it might be challenging, I think that's the hard stuff, right? We keep saying how hard this work is and we don't really articulate why, but this is an example of why. And I think that it's incredibly important to do as well, and not, you know, shy away from it. And I don't think Charlie was saying we should. I think the opposite, but I just wanted to sort of iterate that point.
And I think that's where like some sort of outline of like community agreed upon values could be helpful for the teachers to kind of like revert back to and say, you know, this is actually exactly what I'm supposed to be teaching and what I'm supposed to be doing what if conflict does arise, so that there's it's more concrete than it sounds like it might be right now. It might make it easier when those difficult discussions come up.
Okay. Well, thank you. Let's move on to our next discussion item, which is the second reading of the Intra-District Transfer Policy. You'll recall this is the policy we've had in place for quite some time that has to do with when a family decides or for whatever reason decides they want to apply to go to a different school within the district. And we have a very specific policy in place about that, which talks about the application process, the discretion of the superintendent, and so on. So Emily, I don't know if you have any comments you want to make on this. We're here for the second reading.
No, just to remind people, there's really no substantive change to the policy. It's just some housekeeping things that have to do with like references to years that have already passed.
Right. Anybody have any comments, thoughts? Okay. All right. Action items. Approval of the March 11th, 2021 meeting minutes. Can I have a motion to approve those minutes, please?
I'll make a motion.
Can I have a second? Okay. Any discussion or comments on the meeting minutes from that date? Seeing none, we'll take a vote. Maya Plotkin,
Yes.
Tony Mullen,
Yes.
Amanda Phillips,
Yes.
Charlie Donahue,
Yes.
and I am a yes. We are unanimous. We have approved the minutes from March 11th, 2021. Going on to the next, approval of the March 18th, 2021 meeting minutes. Can I have a motion to approve, please?
So moved.
And a second?
Second.
Any discussion on these minutes? Okay, seeing none, we'll take a vote. Maya Plotkin,
Yes.
Tony Mullen,
Yes.
Charlie Donahue,
Yes.
Amanda Phillips,
Yes.
and I'm a yes. The motion carries. We have approved those minutes of March 18th, 2021. Now we're on to acceptance of scholarships. The first is a gift of $2,020 from the Westwood High School class of 2020. We love these, but we have to approve of them. So can I get a motion to approve? We'll start with that first gift.
So moved.
To accept, I mean. Thank you. A second?
Second.
Anybody have anything to say about this scholarship? Okay. All right.
I just want to clarify that it's a scholarship in the amount of $2,020, but it's going to be a recurring gift. So it would be given annually, but you can accept it one time tonight and then
In perpetuity. Perfect.
Yes.
Okay. Let's take a vote. Maya?
Yes.
Tony?
Yes.
Charlie?
Yes.
Amanda?
Yes.
And I am a yes. We approve of that gift. Thank you to the class of 2020. Going on to the next one, the gift of $4,000 from the Billy Varkas Scholarship Foundation. Could I get a motion to approve this scholarship?
So moved.
So second.
Okay. Is there any discussion or comments on this particular gift? No? Okay. So let's vote. Maya Plotkin?
Yes.
Tony Mullen?
Yes.
Charlie Donahue?
Yes.
Amanda Phillips?
Yes.
And I am a yes. So we accept and approve that gift. Thanks to the Billy Varkas Scholarship Foundation. Going on to new business. Does anyone have any new business this evening? Okay, seeing none. How about we adjourn? How about a motion to adjourn?
I'll make that motion to adjourn.
Okay, Tony, I like
The
that.
one motion he makes.
Yeah, good. Mayor, second. All right. Amanda, you ready to go?
I'm ready.
Okay, Charlie?
Yes.
Okay, Tony?
Yes.
Maya?
Yes.
I am too, and I think the rest of the team are as well. Listen, everybody, great meeting. Thank you so much. Have a good evening.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thanks, everyone.
Good night.